Downtown Frostburg has always been a link between the past and the future. Businesses of yesterday and tomorrow coincide to make up this small, beautiful mountain town. One of the most iconic features of downtown Frostburg is the old Palace Theater, which has been around since before our great-grandparents. There isn't a person alive in Frostburg that remembers a life before the theater. The bright neon lights and round yellow bulbs illuminate the marquee that stood over Frostburg's sidewalk since its early beginnings. Unfortunately, the theater has had some issues with maintenance in recent years and has forced volunteers of Frostburg to step up. To understand the importance of the theater, I talked with Kurt Deffenbaugh, who explains a little bit about the history of the Palace. You're watching the Preserve of the Palace series with your host Michael Warnick from WGLZ 91.5. We are college radio, and we are passionately vocal. So now, on to Kurt with the history of Frostburg's historical Palace Theater.
History is, as we best understand it, because it's a little difficult to get all the details, but apparently this was opened as a Nickelodeon in around 1905, 1906, and it functioned as a Nickelodeon from 1906 till 1914. And then in 1914, the Spates brothers decided that they wanted to move on from being a Nickelodeon into being a full-fledged theater. So they had what is the back part, what we call the theater, built on. And in 1916, they opened basically as the Palace Theater as we know it today. Right. And they ran that theater from 1916 to 1981. So that's what, about 60 years? A little more than 60 years? Of course, in the 1980s, what was happening, we saw downtowns across the United States were being eroded. Everything was moving out to the periphery, including movie theaters, shopping. And so it was no longer financially viable for them to stay open here. And they shut it down. But luckily for the city of Frostburg, a group of concerned citizens came together in '83 and said, we can't let this building disappear. And we can't let it become something else, We can't let it just become a storefront. We can't let it become, whatever would have happened to it. So they ended up forming a nonprofit group and basically taking on a mortgage. And by '87, they had saved the Palace and it moved from being the Palace Theater to the Palace Theater Incorporated, which is a nonprofit entity. Right. So that's the basic history.
The history of the Palace has always been interesting and shrouded in mystery. Through time, pieces of the original Nickelodeon were either destroyed or renovated, leaving bits and pieces of each generation behind it. With only 8,000 Nickelodeons in the US in 1919, the Palace is one of the few still standing today after the war, depression, and rezoning. Almost all major Nickelodeons were put out after the rise of drive-in theaters and cinemas, making the theater truthfully unique. One of the most fascinating parts of the Palace is the projector room, which really feels like a time machine behind the glass. Kurt goes on to explain a little bit more about the workings of the vintage theater.
So this camera projector and that projector was originally what's called a xenon arc camera. And I don't know a lot about the technology, but they were two rods and they burnt and they created an arc between them. And that arc gave off light that you projected film. And so up until the 1940s, I believe, you don't quote me on that one, that is how the light was produced. Right. So then what they did in the 1940s is they gutted out these things and they put what's called xenon bulbs, which are just really strong light bulbs in them, and they continued to use the housing to project film. So when we got involved with the Palace, when the Palace in 2000 reopened as a really functioning movie theater and arts venue, we bought these old things. Right. And from 2003, when we started showing movies again, till 2014, 15, when it started to get hard to get films, you saw, if you were here at the Palace, you saw movies being projected on these really old systems.
These really old systems, as Kurt puts it, is one of the most unique parts of the Palace, with history dating back before 1920 and still being put in use today. It adds to the authentic feel of the old theater. Because of this, the film displayed on these really old systems are also really old. In part with their nonprofit mandate, this causes the theater to display classic films, documentaries, foreign film, and independent films. Kurt goes on to explain a little bit more about the film showed at the Palace and how it adds to the unique experience.
When we opened as a theater again in 2003, our mandate, because we're a nonprofit, is to try to show films that aren't available in this area. Right. Around here we have a few commercial theaters and they're showing first-run commercial films. So we basically were mandated to show classics, foreign films, American independent films, and documentaries. So, in showing these types of films, what we're making available to people, obviously, is film that isn't available. And we're allowing people to access like parts of our culture that they don't necessarily get, because the mainstream film industry is not necessarily interested in exposing you to the culture of your society. It wants to make money. And especially with like some of these classics. By showing classics, what we're doing is trying to link the history of film together and say, take the film maybe your uncle saw and show it in a place where now you and your uncle are sitting in the same place that like he showed a movie, and you're having this experience together, and it's generational, and I think it's a crossing of like culture.
It's really special because there's nowhere else I know where you can go and do that.
Nowhere else I know of either. I mean, I'm sure there's some cities that have been able to save their theaters, but it's a fight, and they don't always succeed, or they're not able to do it for so long. I mean, we've been able to do it for 20 years, and to me, that's a success in and of itself.
The history of the theater is pretty well understood now, but what isn't quite certain is the future of Frostburg's oldest beloved theater. Challenges such as COVID, home streaming, and prices of film are challenges that all theaters have went through at some point in their history. However, with the long history of the Palace building comes a lot of different issues that many theaters never have to overcome. I asked Kurt what the future of the Palace is looking like, and this is what he had to say.
I mean, that's a good question, right? I mean, it's part of a bigger question. Where's the future of our downtowns headed? Are we going to dig in and say, okay, it's really important to have a life in the center of our towns? Or are we always going to let things exist just at the very margins? And now, are we going to let things exist on the internet? Any movie we're showing here, you can easily watch at home, right?
Yeah.
You can sit in your house and you can watch them. But there's two things, like you'll be all by yourself probably,
Yeah.
and you may or may not be fully engaging. You may not be an active participant because you may also be working on your homework. You might be cooking dinner. You might be looking over your shoulder, And in that way, you become a very passive consumer of film. But when you're here with you're here with probably 75 to 125 other people. Because we don't get to show film all the time, it's not like you can usually go, like in a regular theater, you can go on a Tuesday night and there might be 12 of you, right? And you don't know anyone. But if you come here to a film, chances are you know half the people here, So you're sharing that experience with a group of people, and you're sitting in a theater, a traditional theater, and you're in an active role, which is there's nothing else to do. You can't be on your phone, you can't be cooking dinner, you can only be watching the film. And I think that's the value of this experience.
The Palace is pretty special to anybody that has ever walked under the neon lights and past the old ticket stand. But there are issues beyond competition and interest. The Palace Theater has been nurtured by a group of concerned locals who were vital in ensuring its future. However, there is only so much time and money that they can put in themselves. I asked Kurt what needs to happen to ensure the future of the Palace, and this was his response.
Well, I mean, I think probably a lot of people are aware we're currently trying to get a new roof on the building.
Right.
Because without a roof, it's the end of the project, right? One good snowstorm that melts and comes through, and the project's probably done. So partially what we're trying to do and get this roof on is we want to have a really high quality rubber roof put on that will last for a very long time. And partially that is the current group of people who are like making this possible, the volunteers who do all this work and open up the theater so people can come and enjoy themselves. We're not going to be here forever.
Yeah.
I want to leave a theater, here that after I don't have any more energy to do this, you could take over. And one thing I don't want you burdened with a roof problem, because if you get burdened with a roof problem, maybe you're not going to be able to show film. Our priority is first and foremost, preserve the building. Then on top of that, once the building's preserved, we can also show films, have concerts here, make it available to the public. So currently what needs to be done is we need to have this roof put on. And that's what we're doing. We've had a thing we're calling Raise the Roof fundraiser. And the really cool part about this is we've raised $23,000 in direct donations from people here in town. I could have never expected. Yeah. I really thought, wow, if we can raise $10,000, we'll be doing really good. That's good money, That's showing that people want this. Well, $23,000 doubles that, right?
Finally, as a student of film, I have a deep appreciation for this theater. There are not a lot of places you can watch the evolution of film in a natural way, with original projectors and film. The volunteers that currently run this theater won't always be able to, so it's up to the younger generations to take over where Kurt and the other volunteers left off. Kurt explains how we can get involved in different ways to ensure our grandchildren have the same experiences as our grandparents.
There's lots of ways people involve. I mean, obviously people have already given really generously, and of course people can help out with more money. That's, we love that, but there comes a point where I can't say, oh, keep giving, One thing people can do that's really easy is come to the movies. One, we make some more cash off the proceeds from the film, help go to it. But two, I think when people come to the movies, then the people who are doing this feel like, oh, that was great. We had a good night. You know what I mean? People really enjoyed themselves. They're talking in the theater. They're walking home. That helps immensely. The third thing people can do that is also really helpful is just tell other people about the movies. Because, we advertise on the marquee. WFWM puts us on their announcements. The newspaper will announce it. But, I think we live in a time where social media is flooded with stuff. You can do stuff every day, So I believe strongly in the idea, in the personal word, like that if you enjoy the movies and you like coming here and you like, you want this to be here for your future children and future generations, then you're more likely to tell your brother, come to this film. You're more likely to tell your friends, and that is really essential. Because I think that is how the Palace goes from being a place that a handful of people, to a lot of people come to. And once they're aware of it, then you never know. You don't know who's going to come out of the woodwork and say oh, I know how to do something, or oh, I have this. So I think that's really the main thing people can do is talk to people about the theater.
It's up to the citizens of Frostburg to ensure the future of the Palace Theater. A building that has given us generations of countless memories is at risk, but it's not too late. Remember those feelings in the old theater seats behind the big curtain? Remember the late nights with family and friends that make us nostalgic of a time before our own? Remember those high school events from when it was just an easier time? Remember the smell of the fresh popcorn when you walk down Downtown Frostburg? Remember the neon lights that have become an iconic image of this town? And remember that all of that might be gone if we don't come together and raise the roof. Because the Palace is not just something to remember, it's something to experience. Because when we lose this theater through time, we lose all the memories from generations that have already came. But even worse, we take them from the generations that haven't. To find out more about Raise the Roof Project or upcoming showings and events, visit frostburgpalace.org.